Well, thank you for coming back to Dahlberg Music TV. We are reading currently Love Kills the Assassination of Kurt Cobain by Hank Harrison, read by Bradley Dahlberg in 2024. And we are finally up to Chapter 8 called Strange Fruits. He'll hop along with us here as the defense. I am neutered. And Spade, what the hell am I trying to say? Kurt Cobain from Nevermind. Kurt's paradoxical value system, his uncanny giftedness, have long been the topic for speculation. How could anyone create music as seemingly insane as Tourette's, and yet have an audience gasping at the profound revelations overcome as you are? The fatal answer is to say, hey, it's show business, folks. But that would betray their magical motivations for music. Billy Corgan's brother had Tourette's syndrome. Maybe there is some connection there. Was Kurt mocking Corgan? Before I offer my suggestions, we need to look at the background of grunge as it emerged from punk and heavy metal circa of 1988. Skinhead punk is a fantastic and sadistic and perfect background music for the next Holocaust. Nazi core lyrics, when they can be understood at all, tend to be homophobic, xenophobic, laden with overt sexism, and often downright racist. The lyrics emerging from the grunge, although self-flagellating and guilt-driven, possesses a refreshingly anti-fascist tone and are always radical and socially enlightened. Kurt's lyrics were in addition always grounded in reality. Just dig deep enough and there's a link to everyday life. Grunge as an ethical and anti-materialistic statement did not die with Cobain. Grunge was not short-lived fad. As long as we have fascism, we will need to be an antidote, and grunge is, trust me on this, the perfect antidote. Now it's called alternative music, but grunge was more than music. Whereas early punk seethed with garbled lyrics and spiteful noise reflective of their class struggle in England, grunge played by Screaming Trees and Nirvana, Bikini Kill, Tad, the Melvins, and a handful of others tended to be consolatory. Or in that case of Cobain's Rape Me, invitational. Early punk was nihilistic. When Sid Vicious screamed, "Fuck you," he meant it, nothing more. He wasn't really looking for a fight, but when Cobain chortled, "Rape Me," he was throwing down a gauntlet. Kurt was saying, "Come on, heap it all on me. You can't beat me down, and I reject your quest for wealth." Contrasted to the Gandhi's pacifism, Cobain's grunge on the stage presence, video, lyric, sound, and offstage lifestyle was proactive and in your face. I repeat, Kurt was not violent. He broke up his guitar on stage, but that wasn't new. Jimi Hendrix lit his on fire. Pete Townshend bashed one at every gig. Willie Nelson managed to strum several holes into his. We have absorbed violence and brutal sexuality on television to the breaking point. By now everyone's been flipped by the phallic digit on the freeway at least once. Fuck you no longer means let's fight. But the taunting strategy used in grunge comes from an active sense of superiority, an inner belief that the speaker really is invulnerable, because he or she wields the sword of true compassion and cannot therefore be easily ignored or defeated. Like St. Michael, St. George, and King Arthur, and finally, as the tarot, the sword symbolizes the judicial decisions. Whereas punk, Nazi, and Brit punk can be defined as a barroom brawl waiting to happen, grunge possesses a certain promise of salvation, a lure designed to pull in the enemy prior to devouring him in the global dining table. This is not the same as Courtney's need for revenge. Cobain said it best as he included the phrase meat-eating orchids in his lyrics, and when he grew fascinated with botany, the casual listener may think Kurt was toying with this imagery, but I believe he was able to penetrate to the depths of the biological contract in nature. In his Venus flytrap paradigm, the beautiful plant ends up absorbing the prey before returning to the state of serenity. Therefore, I suppose the higher strategy in the grunge rape me ideal is more the effective than the hard edge, but it's also a kind of triple think, and it too can easily lead to violence. Nazi core punk blurts out hate and throws it back to the wind. It is futility, and futility grows angst, which is, I gather, a desired end result. But when it comes to the musical miracles, the Nazi punk substrate doesn't work. The minute you jump on a on the bandwagon, you limit yourself for life. Grunge has an outreach. Grunge has more outreach than punk. It's an egalitarian approach, inviting in a rather excluding disenfranchised, and it offers more positive processes to the survival of the alternative world. Kurt did survive. His actions and ideas survived him, but he was well on the road to greater glory when somebody killed him. If he were suicidal, it would only mean that grunge was an indefective strategy. But if he was murdered, it would mean that he sure pissed off a lot of people. I choose to think that Kurt died because of his self-styled philosophy did catch on. I do not believe that grunge as a personal statement is a pre-force, suicidal, or negative, and I doubt Kurt would have ever let that many people down. I think a lot of people in power want us to believe he killed himself so that we will all take less of a notice of his ideas, but I assure you Cobain was a threat and will remain so even beyond the 21st century. Both punk and grunge derive from the proto-bohemian antecedents. Punk, as played by the Sex Pistols, is nothing more than stylized anarchy, and as such can be traced to the Vigosloths and the Mongol hordes. Grunge is a little newer, but has historical roots. Cobain tattered fashion statement as 200 years old when Iggy Pop and the Velvet Underground hit the stage. Kurt may have improved it, but he didn't invent the torn pant leg and the tattered flag. How did he do it? What was the magic secret? Well, I won't hold you in suspense. I think that Kurt used his machoism as a sales tool. Outside of Asia and the Holocaust, the masochistic political statement can be traced back to the Christian martyrs, the Jewish Masada, and the sacrifice of the Albigensian crusade that killed off most of the troubadours in AD 1120. In the 18th century in Paris, during the Reign of Terror, two wacky dissident groups vied for political attention. Les Chevaux et la Victime, punk form, were basically high-camp pair fags who, their name implies, pranced around posing as an atrocity in the exaggerated costumes and powdered wigs made with human hair retrieved from the heads of the guillotined. The more sedated dissident Les Incroyables, grunge form, my French isn't that great, scurried around the streets, and sometimes in the proximity to the wig freaks and their macabre lifestyle, Lapon dressed like, identified with the poverty-stricken victims of the remnant medieval economy. The demonstrators looked so authentic that the most of the observers could not discern between the demonstrators and the real pushcart folk. These grunge-like murmurs called themselves champions of the stricken classes. Sound familiar? Les Chevaux has been comfortable in CBGB's or Manic Panic in Soho, New York. In the early 1970s, they may have understood the red Mohawk punks of London. Controversially, Les Incroyables would have looked fine in Kurt's entourage. I'm convinced history really does repeat itself. The rape me taunt is frighteningly effective. It seems to have come from a dreamlike belief softened by drugs that you can confront authority head-on and win. It's an old Trotskyite doctrine, and it works from the farm communities. Chavez and Gandhi used it to a great effect. It seemed to be working in the field of saving and pets, fuzzy furry creatures, mainly because you have an instant poster boys and instant confrontation for television, but it hasn't worked out well in urban micro-politics. It hasn't done much for the environmental or overpopulation concerns, and it hasn't saved the rainforest yet. Cobain was aware of the deficiencies in his self-sacrificing philosophy, and he wasn't taking steps to fix the problem. He was going to divorce his crypto yuppie wife and drop out for a while. The original punk movement was anarchy set to music. The punk of the 1970s consisted of the anti-intellectual balderdash emanating from the sloth of the British Polaroid racisms. Most of the bands spewed from drivel with no socially redeeming content, not even nihilism, and it was loud and cacophonious, and the sounds had no healing power. The brand of the punk died, or it dwindled to deathly levels in the mid-1980s, leaving a vacuum in its wake. Kurt was looking for just a vortex. The tendency to anarchy was still alive in the schools and on the streets, Now when you have anarchistic movements lasting more than a few days, you get institutional masochism. Here is where Cobain jumps on board. The hook for him, the Captain Marvel bit, the cripple newspaper boy. Who could say a magic word like Shazam? A flying crusader with the supernatural powers, already ready for flight, for justice, an alternative way. By 1991, the grunge movement was an event waiting for a leader. Kurt naturally stepped in and wrote the music for the march. And by the late 1980s, grunge was driven by a new Seattle-Portland nexus and began to reactivate the punk sensibilities by canceling racism, sexism, and blending over rebellion with the new beat of the generation of hagiography. This new beatcore sound came from the age of Nirvana and literally shook the music industry. It blew away some old beatniks too. Although Kurt played down to introspectiveness, he worked his ass off physically and emotionally, and he was a strong man, and although I never got a chance to meet him, I was damn proud of him. Sadly, like most workaholics, he seemed disengaged much of the time. This is made easier for people who believe that he was suicidal in the aggressive mode, was that Kurt was a mensch. In his passive mode was a waif, and a lot of his fans saw themselves that way. But the waif was a pajama-clad poet, an imaginary sylph reflecting on the muses in his very own forest pond. His genius fed both personalities. After the successes of Nevermind, and especially after the baby was born, Kurt seemed to grow out of his waifish cocoon. Every time he ventured onto the stage, he became more and more like Chavo Guerrero. By the late 1993, long after In Utero hit the airwaves, Kurt began to see his music and his mission in his new light. Every concert was a workshop. What was once a band on the run began to take shape of a theater of the world. But something was going wrong with the demographics. What was once a club full of new wave slackers became an auditorium full of well-fed crossover people. The audience wasn't moshing anymore. Many thrill seekers just came to Nirvana gigs to see the freak show and observe the full-grown child man-like, with the rock star wife, the beautiful baby, standing at the center of the rock and roll cosmos. Kurt needed a crowd to be on his side, but after Nevermind, more and more superficial demands, new audience struck a discordant note. The audiences were big, but on the wrong page. Kurt didn't want to be worshipped. Courtney did. After the European tour of 1992, Kurt no longer pleased the old cronies or the bubblegummers. His only hope was to please himself and his music. He was headed forward to a new mystical direction, one not completely understood. I think it came from the exposure to the cathedrals that he visited on tour. Mystical things happen when you visit places like Chartres Notre Dame or the Familia Sagrada in Barcelona. The sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows can etch its way into the most hardened soul. Kurt's punk days were over. Already he was making celestial sounds, in my opinion. Kurt was off to a higher spiritual level, a plane upon which he could, like Bob Dylan, Neil Young, and other troubadours, explore true mysteries of music and poetry. Courtney threatened by losing control of Steve Albini. Kristen Paff and Chris Novoselic escalated their castle coup. And when In Utero came out, Geffen's Bottom Line executives, each interacting with Danny Goldberg, began sending disapproval signals in the form of slouchy body language. Towards the end of 1993, they were just moving into a big house, and Kurt blew a fuse. His beloved Carnation House was finished but empty. Billy Corgan kept courting Courtney. The baby was in need of security. Kurt needed strong and selfless people around him, but all he had were slaves to white powder. He could no longer trust Courtney. I think he saw the mask, and behind the thought that he might have to raise his daughter in a warlike environment seems to have made the kid from Aberdeen weaker. He realized all of a sudden that he was a little more than bondage slave, especially now that Courtney's career was about to shift into overdrive. So now we see a glum picture. Kurt Cobain on the edge of ADHD eternity, calling Chris for a ride to rehab, sitting on an old upholstered chair in a cave cabin in Carnation, waiting for the electrical wiring inspector to sign off on his dream house, dragging on cigarettes and butting them out in a bent tuna can, of all while wondering if Beavis and Butt-Head experienced the Anthology CD which includes some early Nirvana cuts, will be released through Walmart. Meanwhile, his old lady in his dorm a Troyos with the lawyer and managed somewhere in La La Land. And that's the end of chapter 8. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and check out each chapter of this book till we get to its end.